Have you ever wondered what life was like for a medieval peasant? What they did, how they lived, and how they spent their days? In medieval society, your social standing defined many aspects of your life. It influenced what foods were available to you, how colorful or plain your clothing might be, and whether you could hope for any formal learning at all. Because social standing was so important, medieval life was like an elaborate patchwork, with each piece of the hierarchy stitched carefully in place. Nobles at the top enjoyed a grand lifestyle, while others with fewer privileges and fewer comforts lived much simpler lives. These peasants made up the bulk of the population, working the land and handling the most essential tasks to keep society running. In this medieval framework, where you stood was more than just a label. It set the path of your daily life. But what were medieval peasants' living conditions like? Peasants commonly lived in tight-knit villages, which were often established around two major landmarks. The first was the manor where the local lord resided, the second was the church. Their homes were decidedly modest, reflecting the limited resources and practical mindset of the people. Typically, these residences were cottages built with materials that were easy to gather from the surrounding environment: timber for the framework, wattle and daub to shape the walls, and thatch to create a simple yet effective roof. Although these dwellings were far from grand, they served their purpose well enough. They offered some protection against the elements, shielding inhabitants from rain, wind, and chilly weather. But during the day, their daily work shaped much of their life, and it is a revealing window into the medieval world. Life for medieval peasants was centered around hard work. Much of their days consisted of tasks that demanded both physical energy and mental focus. From sunrise to sunset, peasants devoted themselves to routines that revolved around their land, their livestock, and the fields they either held or worked on behalf of others. Most peasants, even those considered relatively comfortable by peasant standards, typically tended or owned only small plots of land. These plots could be quite modest, and sometimes they were only large enough to grow crops needed to sustain a family. Yet the exact size and nature of ownership varied significantly. In some cases, one family might work a tiny piece of farmland that produced just enough to get by, while another family might have slightly more farmland and a bit more freedom in deciding how to use it. But overall, farmland remained precious and was usually managed as carefully as possible. Many peasants worked fields that belonged to a local lord. This lord could be a noble who had earned or inherited title and property. In some places, the church itself also owned large swathes of land, and peasants might work under religious authorities or representatives. In exchange for the right to plant their own crops and use the lord's fields, peasants had to pay rent. Often, payment took the form of manual labor, which meant working on the lord's fields. They would plow, sow seeds, harvest. Additionally, peasants could owe different kinds of goods produced on their own plots. For instance, if they grew grain, they might be required to pay a certain portion of that grain to the lord. If they raised sheep, the wool from those sheep could be another form of payment. They also had to set aside time to fulfill maintenance obligations. This might include fixing fences, mending roads, or contributing to the upkeep of areas on the manor. Such tasks were part of the ongoing relationship between the peasants and the manor. The commodities peasants produced, like grains, vegetables, or wool, were valuable in the local or regional trade markets. They occasionally had surplus goods. Trading or selling these could allow them to gradually improve their circumstances. Over time, a few accumulated enough wealth to acquire more land. Another key aspect of a peasant's life was the strong impact of the changing seasons. Because much centered around farming, the weather and the time of year dictated the tasks that needed to be done. Spring was a time of renewed activity. The fields needed plowing, seeds had to be sown. During the summer, peasants tended to their fields and could do some harvesting. In the late summer and early autumn, they would do their main harvesting, which meant long days out in the fields cutting grain or picking produce. Harvesting was a physically demanding and time-consuming task that required long hours of effort. During the autumn, peasants had to preserve and process the crops they had gathered. They might store grains, dry herbs, or pickle vegetables. ensuring that the community had enough food to get them through the colder season. Winter itself brought shorter days and colder temperatures, prompting peasants to spend more time indoors. During winter, peasants might mend tools, make or repair clothing, and tend to livestock in barns or shelters. Within their homes, peasants focused on practical projects. They might use wool from their sheep to spin yarn that could eventually be woven into cloth. Peasants aimed to ensure that their families had enough warm clothing, a steady supply of preserved foods, and tools or utensils ready for the next round of work. They were resourceful with whatever was available. All these activities, ploughing, sowing, harvesting, preserving, and maintaining, formed the cycles that shaped the entire year for medieval peasants. Each season came with its own set of duties, and people used every bit of daylight they had. Through cooperation with neighbors, smart management of resources, and the occasional lucky break with weather or trade, peasants could keep their families fed and sometimes even gather a little extra profit. When peasants did manage to save or earn a bit more than usual, that surplus could be invested back into their farms. In some cases, those extra earnings might help them secure slightly larger plots of land. Although medieval society was generally rigid in terms of social class, moments of advancement were not impossible. A big concern was having enough land to support the entire household, since many families found themselves with only a fraction of the acreage they needed. Some peasants had no land at all, which meant they had to seek work on someone else's fields for modest wages or a share of the resulting crops. Land was typically managed under the manorial system. Each manor usually contained 2 or 3 large open fields, as well as pastures for livestock. The bigger fields were divided into many narrow strips, which were assigned to various peasant families, although these strips might be scattered in different areas. If one strip didn't yield enough, other strips might make up the difference. Among the clever techniques that helped sustain these communities was crop rotation. Peasants regularly moved their chosen crops among different sections of land, leaving one field fallow, unplanted, for a season. By allowing the earth to rest, they prevented soil depletion and ensured better yields over time. This rotation system might involve planting wheat in one field, oats or rye in another, and letting a third field lie fallow. The goal was to keep nutrients cycling through the soil so the fields would stay productive. The types of crops grown varied by region. Wheat was popular where the ground was fertile enough to support it, but oats, rye, barley, and flax played important roles. These grains and fibers were the foundation of many rural diets. In addition, peasants often raised livestock, cattle, horses, pigs, chickens, and sheep. Cattle and horses were especially prized for their use in work, pulling ploughs and carts, and sheep yielded wool that could be spun into clothing and blankets. Peasants' food were usually simple meals that were guided by what nature provided through the changing seasons. They did their best to make do with local resources, minimizing waste and stretching what they had, an approach shaped by necessity yet reflecting ingenuity. One common dish was pottage, a thick stew made mostly from grains and vegetables, with meat or fish added when available. Cereals were a core part of their nutrition. Barley, rye, and sometimes wheat were ground into flour and baked into bread, a dependable staple. These breads were often dense and rustic. Alongside this, peasants relied on seasonal vegetables, and they would collect fruits and berries. Dairy products, such as cheese and other items, added flavor and extra nourishment. Medieval peasants wore a variety of different clothing. Linen and wool were common fabrics, because peasants could either grow or raise what they needed. In many cases, they would grow flax for linen, or rely on their sheep for wool, ensuring that they had a steady supply of raw materials. These fabrics suited their day-to-day tasks in the fields and gardens, giving them something both protective and comfortable. Outfits included tunics. These tunics were often knee-length for men and ankle-length for women, and brays, loose-fitting trousers that were tied at the waist with a drawstring or belt. Over the brays they could wear hose, which were fitted cloth coverings for the legs and sometimes also the feet. These could be tied to the belt to stay in place. Footwear could consist of leather turnshoes, which were made from leather turned inside out after stitching. Hoods were both common and practical. They protected against cold and rain and sometimes had long tails known as liripipes. Another common head covering was the coif, a close-fitting cap worn by both men and women. Colors were generally muted, though simple vegetable dyes could add blues, yellows, or reds. Certain colors and finer fabrics were typically only available for the wealthier classes. The church held a very significant place in the everyday world of medieval peasants. They attended church services, where they listened to sermons and prayed together. Fasting was also practiced as a way to show their devotion. Beyond that, peasants supported the church by paying a tithe. Sundays were special because labor stopped, giving peasants a chance to pause their usual routines. Instead of tending their fields, they could rest and enjoy a break. Holidays, along with local feast days, were equally welcomed, since these occasions also meant time away from the demanding work. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out this video about how medieval peasants traveled. See you in the next one.